I never imagined a single family lunch could push me toward a decision that would quietly redraw the rest of my life. My name is Felicia. I am in my early 30s, and until that afternoon, I still believed keeping the peace was worth almost any personal cost. We were barely halfway through the meal when my dad finally said it out loud calmly, firmly, as if he had rehearsed it in his head long before we sat down. You apologize to your sister, or you accept the financial consequences. There was no raised voice, no dramatic pause, just certainty. I asked what consequences meant even though I already knew. He answered without hesitation. I would be removed from the family trust. I looked at him, waiting for someone to interrupt to soften the words to suggest another option. No one did. I felt the familiar pressure to explain myself, to justify what had happened, to defend my side of the story. Instead, I said one word, all right. It landed heavier than any argument I could have made. My dad nodded, satisfied, convinced the situation was under control. That night, I packed my clothes, important papers, and the few things that actually belonged to me. I did not leave a note. I did not announce my decision, and I did not wait for permission. I closed the door behind me without looking back. The next morning, my phone rang before I had finished my coffee. The family lawyer's voice came through sharp and breathless. Please tell me you did not trigger that clause, he said. Because if you did, your father no longer has control. If you want to understand how a single word unraveled years of quiet pressure, take a moment to subscribe and share your thoughts, because this story does not end where my family expected it to. Before everything finally broke apart, my family had always operated within a structure that felt predictable, orderly, and quietly restrictive. I grew up in a household where calm mattered more than fairness, and where avoiding conflict was treated as a moral responsibility rather than a choice. When tension appeared, it was smoothed over quickly, sometimes so quickly that the real issue was never addressed at all. I learned early that keeping things pleasant often required someone to stay silent, and that someone was usually me. My sister was the center around which many decisions quietly revolved. When mistakes happened, explanations were offered on her behalf, often before she needed to ask for them. If her words caused friction, they were reframed as misunderstandings or stress responses. I noticed how quickly concern replaced accountability and how easily consequences softened once emotions entered the conversation. No one ever called this protection, yet it functioned exactly that way. My dad believed deeply in harmony, though his version of harmony depended on compliance rather than resolution. Whenever disagreement surfaced, his response followed a familiar rhythm. He would ask me to be patient, to be flexible, to take the long view for the sake of everyone else. He framed compromise as maturity, even when it consistently required the same person to step back. Over time, his requests stopped sounding temporary and started feeling permanent. My mom supported my dad's decisions with consistency, though rarely with enthusiasm. She believed in unity, in presenting a stable front, and in trusting that things would balance out eventually. When I looked to her for reassurance, I usually received gentle reminders about family loyalty and long-term thinking. She did not dismiss my feelings outright, but she also did not challenge the system that kept producing them. Silence became her way of maintaining peace. Money and financial support were never discussed as tools of control, yet their influence was always present. Assistance came with expectations that were never written down, but always understood. Independence was praised in theory, though discouraged in practice, when it threatened the existing balance. Choices that aligned with family preferences were met with approval, while those that did not were quietly questioned until they felt impractical. Over time, I learned which paths led to comfort and which led to distance. I adapted by becoming self-sufficient in ways that were easy to overlook. I learned not to ask for validation, not because I did not need it, but because it rarely arrived without conditions attached. I handled problems on my own, solved disagreements internally, and measured my success privately. Each time I stayed quiet, the pattern reinforced itself. And each time I adjusted, the expectation grew stronger. This dynamic did not explode overnight. It settled into place slowly, reinforced by small decisions and repeated compromises that felt harmless in isolation. I did not see it clearly while I was inside it because it had always been there shaping my responses before I realized I had choices at all. That afternoon, every boundary in my family was officially crossed. What was supposed to be a normal family lunch shifted the moment the conversation stopped being casual and turned pointed. My sister Diana announced that she had already decided to sell one of the family properties and that the paperwork was being prepared. There was no hesitation in her voice, no pause to ask for input, just a statement delivered as if the outcome had already been agreed upon by everyone at the table. I asked when this decision had been discussed because I had not been part of any conversation about it. Diana responded that it was unnecessary to consult everyone when action was required, especially when delays caused complications. I tried to stay measured while explaining why the sale raised concerns that could not be brushed aside. The property had long-term value, unresolved obligations, and financial implications that affected more than one person. I asked where the numbers were coming from and who had reviewed them because transparency mattered when decisions carried consequences beyond convenience. Diana dismissed those questions almost immediately, saying I was overthinking details that only slowed progress. She accused me of creating problems where none existed, framing my objections as another example of unnecessary interference. The exchange escalated quickly once she shifted from defending her decision to attacking my intentions. Diana said, I had a habit of complicating simple matters, that I always needed more explanations, more discussions, more time. She claimed that my involvement made everything harder, especially when decisions required confidence rather than hesitation. I responded that accountability was not the same as obstruction, and that rushing forward without clarity often created damage that could not be undone later. My words barely landed before my dad stepped in. He cut me off mid-sentence, his tone firm and unmistakably final. He said this was not the time for debate, and that Diana had already handled the situation appropriately. I attempted to explain that I was not questioning authority, only the process. But he did not allow the thought to finish. He told me that challenging my sister in front of everyone was unacceptable, that it undermined unity, and that my refusal to fall in line was becoming a pattern he was no longer willing to tolerate. I asked why concern was being treated as defiance, especially when the decision affected shared interests. My dad did not answer that question. Instead, he reframed the situation as a matter of respect, insisting that loyalty within the family required restraint. He said that disagreements should remain private, that public opposition created division, and that my behavior was forcing him to address an issue he had ignored for too long. The conversation stopped being about the property and turned into an evaluation of my role within the family. That was when he delivered the ultimatum without raising his voice. You apologize to your sister, or you will be removed from the family trust. The words were clear, deliberate, and left no room for interpretation. I waited for clarification for a softer version for someone to suggest an alternative, but none came. Diana remained silent, watching her expression, steady and expectant. My mom did not interrupt, choosing instead to look down, as if the moment would pass more quickly if she did not engage with it. I felt the familiar pressure to concede to say what was required to restore calm. The expectation was clear because it had been reinforced many times before. Apologize, smooth things over. Move on. This time the cost of compliance was stated openly rather than implied, and that honesty changed something. I realized that the issue was no longer about disagreement or tone, but about control being asserted without question. I said quietly, "All right." The words settled over the table with more weight than any argument I had made. My dad nodded, satisfied that the matter had been resolved. Diana relaxed, confident that the outcome confirmed her position. The lunch continued in strained silence, though the decision had already been made. Nothing else was discussed because nothing else mattered. The lines had been drawn clearly, and for the first time I understood exactly where I stood. That evening, the threat from lunch became real action. The house felt different after we returned, not tense in a dramatic way, but settled as if a decision had already been absorbed by the walls. No one revisited what had been said at the table. There were no raised voices, no attempts to negotiate, no signs of hesitation. My dad moved with quiet certainty, making phone calls behind closed doors, sending messages that were never meant for me to see. I did not ask what he was doing because the purpose had already been stated clearly enough earlier that day. By the time night settled in, it became obvious that this was not a cooling-off period. My dad had taken concrete legal steps to remove me from the trust, acting as if authority alone was sufficient justification. There was no follow-up conversation, no explanation offered, and no opportunity to respond. He operated under the assumption that his role gave him the right to act first and clarify later, trusting that consequences could always be managed once compliance was restored. My mom did not intervene. She did not challenge the speed of the decision or question whether it was appropriate to move forward without notice. She remained silent, offering neither agreement nor resistance, which in practice allowed everything to proceed as planned. Her silence carried weight because it confirmed that this was not being treated as an emotional dispute, but as a corrective measure. The absence of doubt from her side made it clear that legality was not a concern anyone felt obligated to address. That realization landed slowly but firmly. This was not a temporary conflict meant to bring me back in line through pressure. It was a punishment designed to reinforce hierarchy to demonstrate what happened when expectations were not met. The shift from argument to enforcement was deliberate, and it stripped the situation of any remaining ambiguity. I understood then that the family was not waiting for reconciliation. They were moving forward as if the outcome was already justified. I stayed quiet throughout the evening, not because I was uncertain, but because there was nothing left to explain. Any attempt to argue would have been interpreted as defiance, and any attempt to appeal would have been framed as weakness. I recognized the pattern too well to fall into it again. This was not a moment that called for persuasion, but one that demanded clarity about my own limits. Later that night, I packed my belongings with care, focusing only on what was necessary. I did not rush and I did not hesitate. Each item I chose reflected a decision to step away without spectacle or confrontation. I avoided shared spaces, avoided conversations, and avoided the impulse to justify my choice. Leaving quietly felt more honest than engaging in a discussion that had already been settled without me. There was no final conversation before I walked out. My dad did not ask where I was going, and my mom did not stop me. Their lack of reaction confirmed what I had already understood. In their view, the situation had been resolved and my presence was no longer required. I closed the door behind me without making a point of it because I no longer needed to prove anything. Only after I left did the full weight of what had happened become clear. The conflict had crossed a line, moving beyond family disagreement into legal consequence. What began as pressure at a lunch table had evolved into an irreversible action taken under the assumption of unquestioned control. The emotional component had been stripped away, replaced by formal decisions that would carry lasting effects. I did not feel anger in that moment. What I felt was recognition. The system I had spent years adapting to had finally shown its limits, and those limits did not include space for me unless I complied completely. The quiet of that realization was heavier than any argument because it confirmed that the relationship had shifted into something that could not be repaired through conversation alone. By the end of the night, the situation was no longer about family roles or personal disagreements. It had become a matter of authority exercised without restraint and of consequences that would unfold far beyond that evening. I understood then that whatever came next would not be resolved privately because the choices made had already pushed everything into a different territory. The next morning, a single phone call changed the entire balance of power. I had barely settled into the quiet of a new morning when my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another attempt to pull me back into a conversation I was no longer willing to have. Instead, I answered not out of hope, but out of habit. The voice on the other end introduced himself as my grandfather's attorney, Martin Hale, and he spoke with a level of urgency that immediately set him apart from everyone else who had contacted me recently. He explained that he had been alerted to activity involving the family trust late the previous evening. His tone was measured professional, but there was no attempt to soften what he was about to say. He told me he had spent the early hours of the morning reviewing the original trust documents in full, including amendments that had not been discussed openly within the family. According to him, what had been attempted was not a misunderstanding, nor was it a discretionary decision. It was a direct breach of the authority granted to the people managing the trust. This was the first time anyone had taken the time to explain the trust to me in clear terms. Martin outlined why my grandfather had created it, emphasizing that its purpose was not control or leverage, but long-term protection for specific beneficiaries. The structure was intentional, designed to prevent impulsive decisions driven by family conflict rather than responsibility. Until that moment, I had only known the trust as something spoken about, vaguely, always framed as a privilege that could be taken away at any time. He then walked me through the clause that changed everything. The document explicitly stated that I could not be removed as a beneficiary under any circumstances unless I personally submitted a written request to withdraw. There were no exceptions, no discretionary loopholes, and no authority granted to override that condition. The language was precise, leaving no room for interpretation or emotional justification. Hearing it explained so plainly felt like stepping into a room where the lights had finally been turned on. Martin was careful with his words when he spoke about my father's actions. He did not accuse him emotionally, nor did he speculate on intent. Instead, he stated the facts. By attempting to remove me without my consent, my father had violated the terms of the trust and exceeded his legal authority as a manager. That violation was significant enough to trigger serious consequences, including the potential loss of his role in overseeing the trust altogether. As I listened, it became clear that what had happened was no longer a family disagreement framed as discipline. It was a legal overreach with documented evidence. The trust was not designed to reward obedience or punish resistance. It was designed to outlast personal conflicts. And my grandfather had anticipated exactly this kind of misuse when he put those protections in place. I asked Martin what this meant for me, expecting complications or conditions. His answer was calm and direct. My status within the trust remained unchanged. No paperwork filed against me had any legal standing. More importantly, the attempt to alter my position had created a record that could not simply be erased or explained away later. The line had been crossed, and it could not be uncrossed. When the call ended, I did not feel relieved in the way people often imagine. What I felt was clarity. The family had not just tried to pressure me emotionally. They had acted on the assumption that power excused legality. That assumption was wrong. The consequences were no longer hypothetical. And for the first time, I understood that the system my grandfather built was not fragile. It was firm, deliberate, and now fully visible to me. I sat with that realization quietly, knowing that nothing would return to how it was before. The truth about the trust had changed more than my understanding of money or documents. It confirmed that the boundary crossed was real, measurable, and no longer something that could be dismissed as a private family matter. 1 week later, the tone inside my family had completely changed. The first message came from Dad. It was brief, cautious, and noticeably softer than anything he had said before. He did not accuse me of anything, nor did he repeat the words he had used at the lunch table. Instead, he asked how I was doing and suggested we talk soon, framing it as concern rather than authority. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time, he was choosing his words carefully, as if every sentence carried weight he could no longer control. Mom followed shortly after, though her approach was different. She did not ask about my feelings or try to reconnect emotionally. Her focus was practical, almost anxious. She mentioned paperwork timelines and uncertainty about what might happen next. It was clear she was no longer thinking in terms of family discipline, but in terms of exposure and risk. The confidence she once had in Dad's decisions seemed replaced by unease, and she asked questions without expecting clear answers. Diana reached out later that day. When she spoke, the certainty she had shown at lunch was gone. She did not defend her decision anymore, nor did she insist she had been right. Instead, she talked around the issue, acknowledging that things had escalated faster than expected. She admitted that selling the property had created complications she had not anticipated, and that the situation now felt unstable in ways she could not fix alone. Hearing hesitation in her voice was new, and it revealed more than any apology would have. Over the next few days, the family attempted to reset the narrative without addressing what had actually happened. Suggestions were made about meeting privately, keeping things informal and avoiding outside involvement. The language shifted toward compromise, even though no one openly acknowledged the violation that had caused the panic. They spoke as if time itself might undo the consequences provided everyone agreed to lower their voices and stop pushing forward. I listened to all of it without responding directly. I did not agree to meet, nor did I reject their offers outright. Silence became my only answer, not as a strategy, but as a boundary. I was no longer willing to negotiate. Each unanswered message seemed to increase their urgency. Follow-ups arrived faster, phrased more gently, layered with reassurance that no one wanted conflict anymore. What they did not seem to understand was that the absence of my response was not confusion or hesitation. It was clarity. For years, I had been expected to react quickly, to explain myself, to smooth things over before discomfort spread too far. This time, I chose stillness instead. That stillness shifted the pressure entirely, forcing them to sit with the consequences of their own decisions. As the week went on, the imbalance became obvious. The more they tried to regain control through conversation, the more exposed they felt. Without confrontation, without raised voices, the dynamic reversed. They were waiting on me, adjusting their tone, measuring their words, and reconsidering choices they had once believed were final. By the end of the week, nothing had been resolved. No agreement had been reached. No understanding restored. Yet the change was undeniable. The authority they once assumed was gone, replaced by uncertainty they could not manage. My silence did not repair the family, but it revealed the fear underneath the confidence they had relied on for so long. A few weeks later, the dispute was no longer contained within the family. What had once been framed as a private disagreement now existed in written filings, official notices, and legal language that removed any remaining ambiguity about what was happening. I learned that the protective clause embedded in the trust had been formally activated not through emotion or persuasion, but through procedure. The mechanism existed precisely for situations where authority was exercised beyond its limits, and that mechanism did not require my consent to move forward. Dad was formally stripped of his role as trustee after an internal review confirmed that he had acted outside the scope of his authority. The decision was not presented as punishment, but as enforcement. The language was cold and precise, describing violations of fiduciary duty and unauthorized actions that directly contradicted the governing document. For the first time, the power dynamics that had shaped my family for years were irrelevant. What mattered was what had been signed, recorded, and legally binding. I was named as the successor trustee according to the original terms. The appointment was not symbolic, nor was it optional. The document stated clearly that if the acting trustee breached specific conditions, control would pass automatically to the designated replacement. Reading that section felt surreal because it reframed my role entirely. I was no longer the person expected to accommodate or absorb decisions made by others. I was now responsible for ensuring the trust was administered exactly as intended. My parents responded quickly by filing a lawsuit to challenge the change. Their claim argued that I had manipulated the legal system to gain control and that my actions constituted an abuse of legal protections. The filing did not deny that Dad had taken steps to remove me, but it attempted to reframe those actions as justified responses to conflict rather than violations of duty. The complaint relied heavily on intent and interpretation, suggesting that authority within the family should outweigh strict adherence to legal structure. From my perspective, the argument missed the point entirely. The trust was not a family agreement built on preference or hierarchy. It was a legal instrument created to prevent exactly this type of unilateral control. The protections were not activated by my emotions or reactions, but by documented actions that crossed defined boundaries. I did not initiate the process out of retaliation. I became part of it because the structure demanded continuity and accountability. The case entered formal court proceedings soon after. Hearings were scheduled, filings were exchanged, and timelines were established. Everything moved at a pace that felt both slow and relentless. Each step reinforced that this was no longer about reconciliation or apologies. It was about interpretation of law, adherence to fiduciary standards, and responsibility under binding agreements. Throughout the process, I maintained a deliberate distance. I did not reach out, explain myself, or attempt to justify my position emotionally. My role required clarity rather than persuasion. Silence was not avoidance. It was alignment with the reality that the dispute had shifted into a domain where feelings held no authority. After the court hearing, no one in my family was able to keep the position they once believed was permanent. The ruling did not come with drama or raised voices, yet its impact was unmistakable. The court upheld the decision to remove Dad from his role as trustee, confirming that his actions had violated the terms he was obligated to follow. There was no ambiguity in the judgment, no room for interpretation shaped by family hierarchy or intention. The document spoke clearly and the law responded accordingly. Dad did not speak to me after the ruling was announced. There was no apology, no attempt to explain his choices, only a visible withdrawal that carried more weight than confrontation ever could. The authority he had relied on for years was gone, replaced by a legal reality he could no longer influence. Mom remained silent as well. Her earlier confidence replaced by a careful distance that suggested she understood how final the outcome truly was. Whatever unity they once believed they controlled no longer existed in any meaningful form. Diana lost more than she expected. Without the protection she had always assumed would remain intact, her influence faded quickly. Decisions she once made without question were now subject to review, and the privileges she had taken for granted quietly disappeared. No one announced this shift aloud. Yet it was evident in the way conversations stopped, including her, in how certainty left her voice. The safety net that had surrounded her for so long was no longer there to soften consequences. The family itself fractured in ways that could not be repaired. Trust once eroded did not return after the verdict. There were no gatherings to restore normally, no shared efforts to rebuild what had broken. Each person retreated into their own version of the story, unable to reconcile it with the documented truth presented in court. What remained was not anger, but distance that felt deliberate and permanent. I retained control of the trust exactly as the legal structure required. Yet holding that authority did not feel like a victory. It felt like responsibility accepted with clarity rather than celebration. I chose to sever contact with my family not as retaliation, but as a necessary boundary. Continuing relationships built on denial would have compromised everything the process had clarified. Walking away was the only way to ensure the cycle did not repeat under a different excuse. Long-term compromise does not create peace when fairness is consistently denied. It only teaches those in power that imbalance carries no consequence. Law exists to protect individuals who lack authority within their own families, especially when loyalty is used as leverage. Boundaries only matter when they are enforced through deliberate action rather than silent endurance. Thank you to everyone who stayed until the end of this story. I appreciate the time you took to listen to a situation that was uncomfortable, complicated, and deeply personal. Stories like this are not shared to seek validation, but to offer perspective. If you have thoughts or a different viewpoint, feel free to share them in the comments. Your voice matters.